Okie doke. So, peripheral circulation and regulation. The heart is the pump that provides the major force, causing the blood to actually go around and circulate. The blood vessels are the pipes that carry the blood to the tissues of the body and back to the heart. You can kind of think of the blood as cars and the arteries, veins, and capillaries as highways, going from major highways, let's say like 37, to smaller kind of county roads that would be kind of like the capillaries. You've got two major types of vessels in the body. You've got systemic vessels and you've got pulmonary vessels. Systemic, are going to be the vessels that transport the blood from the left ventricle to the body and then back to the right atrium. So systemic is body, is out to body, back to heart. Okay? Now, pulmonary transports blood from the right ventricle to the lungs and back to the left atrium. So this is out to lungs. Remember, pulmonary is just a fancy way of saying lungs, and then back to heart. Sorry, guys, I gotta blow my nose. It's not COVID, just allergies. Okay. So, the functions of peripheral circulation. You're going to notice a lot of overlap with 19 and 20 and 21, but there are specifics to 21. So 1, it carries the blood. It takes the blood round trip from the heart to the tissues and back. Ultimately, people will say, well, where's the blood? It's everywhere. It isn't. It is contained within these vessels. And this highway system is what carries it to its destination and back to where it started. The exchanging of nutrients, waste products, gases with the tissues. Nutrients and oxygen can diffuse from our blood into the cells and the capillaries that are in our tissues. And then the waste products and CO2 can diffuse from the cells into the blood, which picks it up and then drops it off in its respective places. CO2 goes to the lungs so we can go and get rid of it, and other waste products that are, let's say, salts or excess water or things like that actually get transported to the kidneys where it can get filtered out. It transports substances. Not only are we talking about the nutrients and the wastes, but things like hormones. They go through the blood to get from point A to point B, wherever that point B may actually reside. As well, the immune system components, whether we're talking about the white blood cells or we're talking about antibodies, those also get carried through the blood. It helps to regulate our blood pressure. So our blood vessels have a smooth muscle layer around them that allows them to go from the relaxed, smooth muscle creating a fairly large bore hole in the middle of our artery to contracting and making that hole smaller. Doing that influences how hard the fluid inside of this is pushing up against the sides of the artery. That is blood pressure. Ultimately, when we discuss blood pressure, we're talking about how hard is this fluid pushing up against this wall. Okay, so the harder it pushes, the higher our blood pressure. The less it pushes, the softer it pushes. I don't know if that's the right way to put that, the lower our blood pressure. But if we can change the diameter of these blood vessels, we can influence how that blood pressure presents itself. When you are losing blood volume, when you're bleeding, let's say, your blood vessels will actually contract and shrink to try and keep your blood pressure higher. Okay, and then finally, It directs blood flow to the tissues. It can flow with purpose, basically directing circulations to areas in need. A good example of this would be when you're hot, right? You go outside, hot, 125 degrees outside, and you go outside and you turn red, right? Your skin turns red. That's actually because the blood vessels in your skin under your epidermis are actually dilating. They're relaxing, causing more blood flow to go toward the surface of your body. This is very intentional. Why are we doing it? Well, we're doing it so that we can hopefully help to cool not only the body, but the blood a little bit, because it goes to the surface, which is the coolest part of our body. But let's go opposite of that. It is really, really cold. Well, we actually constrict those blood vessels that are going to the surface of our body. Now, I'm not saying we close them. That isn't what I'm saying. But I am saying we make them smaller so that less blood is flowing in that direction, meaning less of the blood is getting cooled, meaning the core of your body shouldn't be cooled by your blood flowing to the surface. It's very intentional to do that. Another good example, and we just talked about this when we were talking about the autonomic nervous system, that kind of shift in blood flow when we go into fight or flight, where I want my skeletal muscle ready to go, I want my heart ready to go, I want my lungs ready to go. The rest of it can just kind of take a walk for right now. I don't necessarily completely cut blood flow off to a part of my body, but I do lessen it so that I can direct it to my skeletal muscle and my heart muscle and my lungs so that I'm better prepared for I need to go and fight the cougar in the parking lot. Okay, so the dynamics of blood circulation, laminar and turbulent flow. Before I forget, don't forget that this specific chapter actually has a homework assignment that you have to get done before the exam. So before exam 2, you have to complete chapter 21 homework. So laminar and turbulent flow in vessels, blood pressure, blood flow in Poiseuille's law, critical closing pressure in Laplace's law, and vascular compliance. So just like water flowing through a pipe, there are certain relationships that affect the function of the cardiovascular system. These include your blood pressure, your blood flow, the resistance to that flow, and the control mechanisms of blood pressure and flow. So let's talk about the flow going through a blood vessel, okay? Laminar flow. Laminar flow is the fluid in a smooth tube moving kind of in a streamlined fashion. The thing is, it flows in concentric layers, with the outermost layer being the slowest. So the outermost layer of this bullseye that you can see here is actually flowing against the stationary wall of this tube, and that creates drag, which means that this outermost layer of our bullseye here, that you can see right here, is going to be the slowest. Now, going into our bullseye, everybody knows that a bullseye looks like this, right? So the next layer in from that outermost layer, this layer, is actually going to be faster than the outermost layer because it's not right next to that stationary wall, but it's still getting dragged on by the outermost layer going the slowest. But again, it's a little bit faster. The next layer in, this layer, actually goes slightly faster than our red or our black layer because it's next to something that is moving. But again, it's one of those things that layer, that black layer that is right here, is still causing a little bit of drag to this layer. So it's still kind of moving just a tad bit slower. The core right here, our bullseye, okay, that is actually going to be the fastest moving blood in our tube because it is not right next to the stationary wall, and the layer that is right outside of it is moving faster than anything else. So you've got this kind of concentric layer model where the outermost, the one next to the wall, is going to move the slowest. And as you get more inward toward the core, toward our bullseye, it becomes faster until that bullseye is the fastest. Now, turbulent flow. Anybody who's ever been on a train, right? Or a plane, you know what turbulence is. Turbulence is roughness, right? So in your blood vessels, when the rate of flow, when how fast that flow is going exceeds a critical velocity, or when the fluid passes a constriction, a sharp turn, or rough surface, it'll cause kind of this turbulence in that vessel. So if you look here, you can see that this is narrowing, right? And as it narrows, you can kind of see this flippy feedback of the blood flow. That would be considered turbulent flow because it's exceeding this critical velocity and kind of hitting that narrowing, causing that turbulence. Now, the vibration caused by the chaotic, there we go, blood flow can actually cause sound. When we take somebody's blood pressure, this is actually when they have their stethoscope in their ears, this is what they're listening for. They're listening for that weird sound that is being caused by squeezing the blood vessel in your arm. You can kind of think of it like taking a balloon and pulling on the ends, and you hear the ee as you do that. When you start to release that blood vessel after you've compressed it with the blood pressure cuff, you listen for that same type of turbulent sound. Abnormal sounds can actually indicate a blocked artery sometimes. Now, it's not common for a doctor to go, oh yes, I know what that is. I know exactly where to listen and all of that. It's not that common, but every now and again you'll pick up on a weird sound and you'll go, wait a minute, that's not the right thing. That's not the right sound. So, looking at blood pressure, again, blood pressure is, here's my artery. How hard is the blood inside of that artery pushing up against the wall of the artery? That's blood pressure. It's the force the blood exerts on the blood vessel wall, okay? We have two major ways of measuring this. A mercury manometer, which is very indirect. This is a mercury manometer. Now, I know you're probably going, mercury, why do they call it that? Well, back in the day when dinosaurs roamed the earth, they used to use mercury in the little gauge that was on the wall. Of course, they stopped doing that because mercury is poisonous and nobody wants poison. They started replacing it with alcohol, kind of like they do in thermometers now. It's alcohol, it isn't mercury anymore like it used to be. Of course, now we also have the ones with the little dial that they put on your arm and they inflate it, where there's not even this mercury manometer anymore. But it's indirect. It's an indirect measure of our blood pressure because we're actually measuring the pressure of the cuff. And as the cuff loosens, we're kind of getting numbers from it. Another way that we can do this is through a cannula. This is literally sticking a tube directly into a blood vessel and measuring it that way. Out of the two, I don't know about you, but if I'm going to the doctor because I have a cold, I don't want them inserting any type of probe into one of my arteries. So out of the two, the mercury manometer is going to be the more practical one. It's more practical to use that in a clinical setting. If you're not going in for some type of heart surgery or something where they're going in surgically, I don't want anything inserted into one of my arteries. Now, the sounds that you're listening for when you do this type of thing, they're called Korotkoff sounds. Okay? Pretty much, this is the point where the cuff loosens enough to allow turbulent blood flow in the artery that's being compressed by the band on your arm. That first number represents the systolic pressure, the pressure that is being exerted when your heart compresses, when it beats, when it squeezes, okay? The diastolic pressure is when you don't hear any more sound at all. So, I put this blood pressure cuff on somebody's arm and I start inflating it. The specific artery that we are trying to compress is the brachial artery. It's the one in your arm, okay? Brachial artery. So as I that brachial artery is getting squished. And eventually, regardless of whether your heart is pumping or not pumping, there will be no sound because I've squeezed it so hard that nothing is moving through it. This is why your hand starts to feel like it's falling asleep. Okay? Now, I start releasing the air. And I'm going to listen. As the cuff gets looser and looser, eventually I'm going to hear something. That sound that I hear, the Korotkoff sound that I hear, is the systolic blood pressure. This is when my heart is squeezing blood through with enough pressure that I'm actually opening that artery. Okay? That first sound that I hear is the systolic blood pressure. Basically, it is the pressure when my heart is squeezing. Okay? So, I keep going. I'm still going to hear the sound when my heart is beating and then nothing. Sound when my heart is beating, and then eventually I'm going to hear another sound. Okay? Or basically, you're going to hear sound, that turbulent blood flow and turbulent blood flow. But eventually, there's no more sound, meaning the blood vessel is as open as the blood vessel is going to get, regardless of whether the heart is contracting or not contracting. When you get to that point where the sound completely disappears, this is the diastolic blood pressure. Basically, what the pressure inside of that blood vessel is, what that blood is pushing up against when the heart isn't pumping. What's that pressure? So you've got your systolic when the heart is pumping and the diastolic. And we're doing this all indirectly. It's an indirect measure, but it's a way that we can measure it easily in a clinical setting. Poisson-Yes's law and Laplace's law. Poisson-Yes's law says a small change in the radius dramatically changes the resistance to flow, thus the amount flowing through a vessel. So what does that mean? If I have a blood vessel this big and I change it to a blood vessel this big, the amount of pressure would change. The amount of resistance to flow would also change. Imagine taking a garden hose and trying to use it on a fire hydrant. How much water are you going to be able to get through that hose? Probably not as much as you could a actual fire hose, right? And it's because of the change in radius. That resistance to flow, the smaller it is, the more problem I'm going to have getting fluid to go through it because it's too small. Now, Laplace's law, the force acting on the wall of a blood vessel is proportional to the diameter times the blood pressure, the diameter of the vessel, times the blood pressure. So literally, how hard this is pushing on the wall here is proportional to how big is this diameter and how high is the blood pressure. How high is this pushing on the sides? So, Poisson-Yes's law, by the way, there's the pronunciation. Blood flow and Poisson-Yes's law. So blood flow is the amount of blood that moves through a vessel in a given period of time. So blood flow is directly proportional to the pressure. If you increase the blood pressure, you increase the blood flow. Think about it this way. If I turn on the spigot in my water hose higher, I increase the amount of water going through the hose. If I turn it down, the amount coming out of the hose goes down. It's the same thing. The pressure is the spigot getting turned on really, really high. The flow is how much is coming out of that spigot. So if I turn it once versus turning it 5 times, there's going to be a difference in what's coming out of that spigot. So blood flow is inversely proportional to resistance. A clean pipe has water flowing through it easier than a dirty pipe has water flowing through it. You increase the resistance, the dirtiness of the pipe, you decrease the blood flow. So they're inverse to each other. One goes up, one goes down. Inverse. Now, the resistance. It's the sum of all factors that inhibit your blood's flow. It's affected by changes in the blood's viscosity. How thick is your blood? Is it runny like water or is it thick like pancake syrup? Because that's going to affect how easily that blood moves in vessels. The blood vessel's diameter. Again, do we have something that's this big or do we have something that's that big? Because if it's smaller, that's a lot more resistance to flow. It's not going to flow as well because I don't have a big enough hole. And finally, changes in blood vessel length. So this kind of goes back to, I guess, let me think of an example. I can throw a football, right? I can throw a football. I can probably throw a football about 30 yards. I'm not that great, but I can throw a football about 30 yards. Within that 30 yards, I could probably throw it and you can catch it. It's got enough oomph or momentum behind it that it'll travel that far with no problem. Now let's say you're 50 yards away from me. Well, I can still throw it and I can throw it as hard as I possibly can, but at 50 yards, it's just not going to have the power. Eventually, as my power that I threw it with kind of peters out, it's just going to fall, right? Well, blood vessel length is kind of the same thing. If your heart is here and it's pumping, it has a certain amount of oomph to it. But if your blood vessel length is longer than that, then it still kind of goes the same length as here, but eventually it kind of starts to peter out again. You got to remember that it's not a constant pressure. Whatever your heart pumps with at the beginning is what you have to work with, period. So if the blood vessel length is really long, it's almost like it runs out of steam before it gets to the end. Viscosity, like I said, if you want an official definition, it's the resistance of a liquid to flow. water versus pancake syrup. If I put water in a pitcher and I pour, it pours out of that pitcher with no problem. Psh. If I put pancake syrup in a pitcher and pour, it kind of goes, bleh. It doesn't really flow per se. That's viscosity. So what affects our blood's viscosity? Believe it or not, primarily it's red blood cell concentration. As hematocrit, or the percentage of the total blood volume composed of red blood cells, increases, so does the blood's viscosity. The higher the concentration of red blood cells, the thicker your blood gets. I already said this, but Poisson-Yes's law is a small change in the radius dramatically changes the resistance to flow, thus the amount of blood flowing through the vessel. If you make a blood vessel smaller, it's not going to be able to carry the amount of blood that it could carry before. As pressure in the vessel decreases, the force holding the vessel also decreases. You got to remember that your blood vessels aren't made out of something solid like plastic. They're made out of something floppy. They're made out of tissue. So if you don't have enough pressure from the blood pushing on the sides, holding them open, eventually they just collapse, okay? Like a deflated balloon. That pressure that we need to keep our blood vessels open, the critical closing pressure is kind of that all or none point at which the blood vessels would close, meaning that blood flow stops. If you don't have enough pressure, yeah, your blood vessels collapse like a deflated balloon. This is one of those reasons why when I went in and I was in shock because of my ankle being broken, they immediately put me on an IV of saline because my blood pressure was low, which meant that this was an issue. Now, why is that so bad? Because if certain blood vessels collapse, your organs will start to get damaged. Usually the ones that are the most susceptible to this are actually your kidneys. Your kidneys are usually the first things to get damaged when somebody goes into shock. So they don't want that to happen. What do? They give you fluid to try and get your blood pressure up to prevent this from happening. Laplace's law, like I said, is the force acting on the wall of a blood vessel is proportional to the diameter of the blood vessel times the blood pressure. So force equals diameter times pressure. In shock, that blood pressure drops. It can cause necrosis. That's tissue death. This is what I was talking about with the kidneys just a second ago. If the pressure is way too high, you can cause an aneurysm. It's like overinflating a balloon. What's going to happen? It's going to pop, right? Same thing with a blood vessel. If you put too much pressure behind a blood vessel, it'll split open. And when that happens, we say you've had an aneurysm.